Good afternoon, and this is the forum where we're engaging culture for Christ. And today's topic is the incoherent notion of tolerance, indifference applied to revealed religion, with our guest Bruce Boeckel from Evidence for Christ. And he's going to start here in just a moment. Just as a quick note, the forum is an open forum for dialogue where we discuss contemporary issues of our day with the view of engaging culture for Christ. And Bruce, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll start off from there.
Okay, good morning. My name is Bruce Boeckel. As Don was telling you, I'm the associate pastor at New Beginnings Community Baptist Church. I'm also a professor of English at Fresno Pacific University. That's a job that is now coming to an end as I'm planning my future in pastoral ministry. And I'm also the founder of Evidence for Christ, which is a ministry in Christian apologetics. I got my PhD in comparative literature back in 1994, and so a lot of these ideas come out of that experience and my experience in higher education. And then in more recent times, I've done my work in Christian apologetics at Biola University and got my MA in that just this past spring. So let's move forward and look at our topic, the incoherent notion of tolerant indifference applied to revealed religion. Tolerance is a troubled term, as I will try to explain today. In a serious sense, tolerance means tolerating something that meets my profound moral disapproval, not something that is merely irritating. This is the original sense of tolerance as it emerged in European society in the 17th and 18th century. That's an area that is part of my PhD level area of study. And this principle of tolerance implies that I am a better person, as is the other person I'm dealing with, when I do not force my moral standard on another by force. So this is kind of the original notion of tolerance, and it arose in a situation in which religion was connected to the political state. So you might have something like the official church, say the Church of England, in which there was the ability to impose beliefs on other people. But the notion of tolerance as it emerged in the 17th and 18th century was that society would be better off not doing that, not imposing beliefs by the force of government or by the force of a monopolized situation. The principle behind tolerance in its original sense was that the other person is also a better moral person being tolerated because he will come to a better moral insight according to his own lights. That is, he would not be compelled by force. And it's also the notion that a tolerant society is a better moral environment because all persons are allowed to explore various viewpoints, coming to their own moral convictions after mature and independent reflection. Again, not having a single viewpoint compelled or enforced by force, or people compelled to accept that. In contemporary Western society has inherited this term tolerance, as I am suggesting, from the 17th and 18th century, but it seems to have forgotten or abandoned the principles that give tolerance a coherent meaning. A quick example of this is a phrase that we often hear in present-day society, the notion of zero tolerance. Zero tolerance applied to things like bullying in elementary school. And so we hear the phrase, we have a zero tolerance policy on X, Y, or Z. One finds that frequently in today's society. So it's a bizarre situation in which tolerance is celebrated as a virtue, and at the same time, institutions don't feel any embarrassment at having a zero tolerance policy towards something. That is the ironic situation that I'm trying to explain today. Another indication of the reason why tolerance is a troubled term is the absence of the term tolerance used in any serious discussions in a positive sense. That is, talking about our need to exercise tolerance regarding an attitude or situation X that meets our profound moral disapproval. Often what you get instead is the zero tolerance policy towards something like that. And instead, tolerance is usually used in a negative sense as a rhetorical weapon against others. In other words, how dare you be so intolerant? That's the way that the word tolerance is used most frequently in today's society. In fact, we are left mostly with the word intolerant used for intellectual bullying in an effort to coerce others to celebrate what meets their profound moral disapproval. And that is my thesis in a nutshell. Those who hold to a revealed religion are committed to uncompromising principles. And these uncompromising principles are in themselves offensive to the contemporary secular mindset. In fact, the very notion of having uncompromising principles is in itself offensive to them. And therefore we see various schemes underway to ostracize or criminalize the holding of uncompromising religious or moral principles. In the best sense, or the sense that's least serious, there's an attempt here simply to ostracize these principles, to say that these principles don't have a seat at the table. They're not the sorts of viewpoints that are worthy of moral respect or serious consideration in the marketplace of ideas. In the worst case, we might talk about actually criminalizing those who hold such viewpoints. And sort of a compromise position would be the situation where there might be something short of criminal penalties, but you would basically be driven out of a certain profession if you dared to have these sorts of uncompromising principles. So let's go back to the notion of tolerance as a troubled term. As I was suggesting, in a serious sense, tolerance means tolerating something that meets my profound moral disapproval, or not something that is merely irritating to me. In other words, it's very difficult to practice tolerance because tolerance doesn't really count as tolerance unless it's exercised towards something that meets my profound moral disapproval. And that means that I have moral principles that can be violated, and yet I exercise a kind of restraint toward those who meet my profound moral disapproval. Now, how is tolerance in this true sense to operate in contemporary postmodern circles? Tolerance requires profound moral disapproval, which implies a commitment to objective moral standards. But of course, one of the primary ideas of postmodern philosophy or the postmodern viewpoint is that there is no such thing as objective moral standards. So in a sense, it doesn't really fit the postmodern philosophy. Also, how is tolerance in this true sense to operate? It requires a conviction that a person's moral compass and moral behavior, that is, those are things that are universalizing factors. We can expect every person to have a moral compass and moral behavior. That these are far more important than skin color, nationality, socioeconomic status, and so forth. Those are the dividing factors, the things that make one person different from another. And usually the focus in the postmodern circles, the focus is on those things that divide us: skin color, nationality, socioeconomic status, various religions and belief systems, where religions and belief systems are really not viewed in a serious way. There's no serious attitude that I would ever be persuaded to accept someone else's belief system. These are just viewed as different flavors. You have your flavor, I have mine. They're not really put on the same plane so that I might seriously consider yours and consider adopting it. Whereas tolerance, in its original sense, views the other person as someone who embodies a certain moral viewpoint, has a certain moral behavior that I would take seriously and that I might object to. Now, without this earlier commitment to objective moral standards and a universalizing vision of human beings as accountable moral agents, that is, as a moral agent just like me, who faces certain moral decisions just as I do, and might make a decision about that I might disagree with, tolerance then becomes an empty term without objective moral standards and without viewing human beings as moral agents that are on the same plane. so that we could have a meaningful discussion about different moral choices that we might make. Without that as a framework, tolerance becomes an empty term. It is merely a relic from an earlier Occidental intellectual history that can be used as a rhetorical club to bludgeon one's enemies or those with whom one disagrees. Let's talk a bit about monotheism and revealed religion. That is, let's talk about a viewpoint that is the opposite of the postmodern viewpoint in which there is no objective truth, and all viewpoints are created equal. That is, they are equally unserious because no one takes any of them seriously. The direct opposite would be monotheism or revealed religion. That is a society in which we have monotheists, people who are committed to a revealed religion and might be committed to competing revealed religions. Rodney Stark is a Christian sociologist who has studied both contemporary religious behavior, for example, the phenomenon of conversion. How and why do people convert to a religion? And he's also studied Christian history, for example, the history of conversions in the early Christian century and how Christianity grew in the Roman Empire, for example, to eventually become the official state religion. Stark has currently published several books on the phenomenon of monotheism, almost as if monotheism is becoming a lost attitude. That is, a worldview that today's cultural elite hardly ever encounters, and which, as a result, they do not understand. It's almost totally foreign to them. Now, Stark contrasts monotheism, what he calls high ethical monotheism, with ancient polytheism as we find it in ancient Greece and Rome. And he also contrasts that with the present-day smorgasbord or consumerist attitude toward religious and moral beliefs. That is, these are items of belief that one ultimately doesn't take very seriously, and they're chosen the way you might choose a flavor of ice cream that you order at Baskin-Robbins. You sort of try out a life philosophy to see if it works for you. And if it doesn't work, you toss it aside and go to the next item on your list. Stark argues that high ethical monotheism is seen in Judaism in its earlier phase when it was a missionary religion, in Christianity and in Islam, is a unique phenomenon that refutes the sort of consumerist approach to world religions that one usually finds in elite and academic circles. This is the way religion is usually studied in departments of religious studies and even in some cases in Christian theological seminaries. Now, his argument is that genuine monotheism, that is revealed religion where one believes that the exclusive truth has been revealed in a religion, that monotheism of that kind is characterized by a number of things, and I will talk about three of them today. The first one is conversion. A monotheistic conversion is a profound turning away from one's earlier way of life and worldview to another way of life and another worldview, with an understanding that one must make an exclusive and uncompromising choice. This is important because conversion in this sense is impossible in a polytheistic culture where one can simply go to one temple, try to appease one god, and then the next day go to another temple and appease another god. One doesn't expect the one god to be jealous of the other, because in a polytheistic system there are many gods that are alive and operating at the same time, and it makes sense to try to propitiate multiple gods. In the same way, in today's secular society, what I call flaky secular society, one can do the same thing. Now, what do I mean by flaky? Flaky means the notion that there does not have to be any ultimate commitment to any one thing. And so one tries out one life philosophy and another one the next day. You might, in fact, practice two contradictory life philosophies, hardly concerned about the fact that they are contradictory. And so the sort of flaky secular person that we see nowadays tries on life philosophies and religions the way you try on a suit of clothes. Or you might mix and match. You might find appropriate accessory because you like its color, and you sort of put on a mixture of these various things. Another characteristic of monotheism is evangelizing. That is, telling another about my God, the only God, in my view, and urging her to consider this revelation as the only solution to her dilemma. In fact, as the only solution to the dilemma of humanity as a whole. That's what it is to evangelize in the name of a revealed religion. You believe that your religion has the answer to the most crucial problem that faces humanity. Your religion gives you both a definition of that problem and it gives you a unique solution to that problem. Now, there is proselytizing in contemporary secular society, but it is usually not done in relation to a transcendent revelation as one would have in a revealed religion. And it does not look to a transcendent source, that is, to God, as the solution of society's problems. And number 3, a congregation. A congregation for a revealed religion is a community of people who are gathered around the one true God. That's the title of one of Rodney Stark's books. They're around one true God and around an exclusive religious revelation. For Christians, this is then a community of the redeemed, or what we call the body of Christ. Now, Stark explains that ancient polytheism had no congregations in this sense. There were religious believers who would gather in groups from time to time. They would even gather for various religious rituals, but they did not form what we understand as a congregation in the monotheistic sense. A polytheistic ritual was really more like a festival or a civic event. You might have a community, say the city of Rome, propitiating one of their gods for favor, so that that god would show favor to the Roman state. When they would declare war, for example, they would propitiate the god of war. Or they might propitiate the god sort of as a measure to try to counteract something bad before it happens. In other words, you seek the god's favor so that they don't turn against you and punish you for your lack of piety. Lack of piety in this case simply means failing to hold the required public rituals and festivals and so on to show a sort of outward honoring of the god. And even the more private religious gatherings that you would have, let's say a private gathering for a feast at a pagan temple. A Greek or a Roman temple was more like a dining club when a group gathered there for a feast. A wealthy sponsor would sponsor a feast of this kind. He would invite his friends and acquaintances to come to the feast. The primary purpose of this was to impress people with the wealth and the fine taste of the person who had put on the feast. The temple would be the site of the feast, and yes, the food and drink would be technically dedicated to the gods and so forth, so that eating those things would be technically honoring the gods. But it was really a gathering, in a sense, of a fine meal and a social event. This was not an event where people would worship God and would gather in devotion to God and draw closer to God and one another. That's the kind of congregation and kind of religious meaning that only takes place with a monotheistic religion. And so there was nothing like the kind of close-knit congregation that Christianity had. Ancient Rome had nothing like that it could offer as a kind of alternative. Now, it is precisely these characteristics of monotheism that I've just explained to which contemporary cultural elites object. They object to people who convert to an exclusive religion and condemn their own old ways. That's what they call brainwashing, and they sort of view it in that way. They object to people who form tight-knit groups committed to one true God and one true belief. That's what they consider to be sectarian and closed-minded. And they object to those who go out evangelizing or colonizing others to bring them into the fold. That second term there, colonizing, is the way in which evangelizing or missionary activity is usually condemned against today's cultural elite. They view that as, in other words, colonialism. And the colonizing attitude is something that they reject categorically, whether that's done in the name of God or anything else. Of course, they are themselves representing the colonizing viewpoint when they try to enforce their attitude on that particular item. So all of this is considered intolerant and unmodern, and is looked down on with scorn. So what would be a secularist's tolerant attitude toward revealed religion? We might ask that question, and I think it should be immediately apparent that this sort of condemnation of monotheism that one finds in many secular circles nowadays is anything but tolerant. It's extremely intolerant because, of course, they understand that monotheism and devotion to a revealed religion is the exact opposite of their viewpoint, of their worldview, and therefore they condemn it. They do not tolerate it. They condemn it and try to condemn it in the world's eyes so that someone who belongs to a revealed religion can't get a serious hearing for his viewpoint in the marketplace of ideas. Now let's do a quick review. Genuine tolerance, as I've suggested, is commitment to the principle that I will tolerate what I find morally repugnant because I reject the use of coercion or bullying in matters of belief. And tolerance is a difficult virtue to practice because it requires me to put up with something that I object to seriously. The secularist mindset of present-day culture, of the present-day cultural elite, finds monotheism and revealed religion to be morally and ideologically repugnant. They seriously object to monotheism or revealed religion. They often argue that revealed religion is the number one evil in today's world. They will point to all of the evils supposedly perpetrated in the name of religion nowadays and throughout history. And so they are militantly opposed to revealed religion. The secularist is then faced with this choice: to either tolerate monotheism out of high-minded principle, because they really do believe in those principles of tolerance, or the other choice is to try to eradicate what the secularist considers to be a cancer on civilized society. So that's the choice that they face: genuine tolerance, or to try to stamp out a viewpoint that they find repugnant. Typically, the cultural elite nowadays chooses the second option. That is, they try to eradicate what they consider to be a cancer on civilized society, and they of course advance all the arguments that they can come up with to try to explain why religion is a cancer on civilized society, why it should be turned away from by all enlightened modern people, and so forth. Ironically, these campaigns to eradicate revealed religion often use such terms as a zero-tolerance policy and so forth. Also, ironically, these campaigns against revealed religion are also often advertised as tolerance because they are campaigns to wipe out intolerance. And it's precisely intolerance that they consider to be morally repugnant. In other words, cultural elites make the easy and self-serving choice, that is, to wipe out their own repugnant enemies, while they celebrate their own intellectual heroism in making the hard choice. In fact, they haven't made the hard choice at all. They have made the easy choice of opposing their enemies with any argument that they can come up with. Secularists claim that they have taken the high moral and intellectual ground in their campaign against intolerance, but as I'm suggesting here, they really haven't taken the high ground at all. They haven't taken the principled ground. They condemn others as judgmental, self-righteous, and sanctimonious. They do not see their own campaign as the epitome of self-righteousness. The upshot of all these arguments is to muzzle the Christian opponent of abortion, for example. Have I skipped some slides here? I have. I've skipped one slide. Let's talk about tolerance on the street. In other words, what would be an example of a specific issue? I'm choosing abortion. And how might this discussion or debate go if one were discussing this with a militant secularist on the one side, and let's say a Christian opponent of abortion on the other side? How would this notion of tolerance come into play? and how might one then try to engage this discussion in a productive way. Suppose that the issue was abortion. The secularist would probably argue against restricting abortion. That is, that would be a violation of free choice. This person, of course, would take the pro-choice position. This person would argue against Christian protests at abortion clinics and so forth, against the use of religious arguments in debates on abortion, etc. One often finds this to be the case, that those who are pro-choice object to the use of religious arguments on the issue of abortion. They sort of want to rule all religious arguments out of court at the very beginning. So arguments about the sanctity of life, because human beings are created in the image of God and so forth, are to be ruled out of bounds from the very beginning so that the Christian can't use those arguments. The upshot of all these sorts of arguments against the Christian opponent of abortion is to muzzle the Christian opponent. If one grants or accedes to these arguments, one no longer has a voice in the marketplace of ideas. I mean, you might still try to come up with arguments against abortion, but they wouldn't be Christian arguments, because the viewpoint of your opponent is that Christian arguments simply are not allowed in the public sphere. So the first strategy would be simply to try to make that plain. In other words, as the secularist, as you would say to your opponent, your real goal is to muzzle me as a Christian so that I cannot make Christian arguments against something that I find morally repugnant, of course, for Christian reasons. Something that I oppose as a matter of profound, well-thought-out principle. The secularist might then respond that the Christian arguments against abortion cannot have force in today's society because such arguments are intolerant. Such arguments undermine the very principles of an enlightened, modern, civilized society. Of course, an enlightened, modern, civilized society being defined in a secularist way, and such a society has to be one in which religious arguments or supernatural arguments are ruled out of bounds from the very beginning. You can see here that what's being argued about at the very beginning are the rules of discourse that are to operate in this debate on the first place. And if the secularist can define the rules of discourse to his advantage, the Christian is muzzled from the very beginning and cannot present any Christian arguments. One can then point out that this definition of a civilized society, or this definition of what enlightened debate is one in which a Bible-believing Christian has no place. Or at best, the Bible-believing Christian is a second-class citizen instructed to sit down and shut up and let other people decide what social policies will rule the day. The secularist has defined himself as the enlightened one, and the Christian place is to be submissive and let social policy be determined by those who know better, those who are fully modern. The arrogance of this position should be obvious, at least to the bystander, if not to the militant secularist himself. And in one sense, what would happen in a discussion like this is if you have an incurably arrogant ideologue that you're dealing with, you wouldn't be able to persuade that person. But it might be possible that some of the bystanders or the people who are listening into the argument will be persuaded, even if you could never persuade your discussion partner himself or herself. It might be impossible to persuade that person because that person is essentially blind to his own arrogance. But those who are listening on the conversation will see what's going on. Now, if you have someone who is not quite as self-deceived, it might be possible with some gentle prodding to get them to see the true nature of their own position, and then the quality of the discussion might change after that. But for the sake of this exercise, I'm sort of imagining a person that is very closed-minded but considers himself to be the epitome of tolerance, and this is sort of the way the argument might go. So we have come to the point of sort of pointing out the arrogance of this position, where the rules of debate are defined in such a way that the secularist gets to make all of his arguments, but Christian arguments are ruled inappropriate from the very beginning. One could then ask the secularist why legalized abortion is so important to him, and why restricting arguments against abortion is so important. Why is it so important that religious arguments don't get their day in court? On this second question, the answer would be a restatement of the damage done to modern society by intolerant views such as Christian opposition to abortion. The secularist finds such Christian arguments damaging and repugnant. It would be a horrible thing if people were persuaded by those arguments. Of course, this means that these views are exactly what the secularist should tolerate as a matter of principle, precisely because he finds them so repugnant. That is, according to the classic and original definition of tolerance. Tolerance, of course, is easy when you're dealing with ideas with which you agree. It's difficult when you're dealing with ideas with which you seriously disagree. Now, pressing on this point will reveal that the secularist does not, in fact, believe in the underlying principles of classic tolerance, that society is better off without the use of coercion in the matters of principled belief. One could then work toward a restatement of the secularist position. In other words, you want to make quick work of Christian arguments against abortion because these are dangerous, unenlightened, repugnant, etc., in your view. Of course, as a Christian, I would say, I don't find my arguments repugnant at all. They are based on the objective truth, in my view. But in your view, these ideas are repugnant. These arguments are repugnant, and you want to discredit them in one quick stroke. The secularist is now in a difficult position, since his closed-minded attitude toward the views of others is unveiled now for public scrutiny. So the Christian might continue. In other words, you want me to stop making arguments against abortion based on my deepest conviction. You want me to swallow down my moral revulsion in silence. That's what I need to do to meet your definition of tolerance and to be a tolerant person. But what about you? What do? You get to campaign for the pro-choice position using all of the central terms of your secularist ideology: enlightenment, modern society, emancipation from religious dogma, etc., etc. These would in fact be the arguments that the secularists have been making all along. Did I get that straight? Am I missing something here? In other words, you want me to be tolerant and to endure in silence what I find absolutely repugnant, what I believe will ultimately destroy society, and that really is the case for the following reasons. These are the sorts of arguments that one would make. While on the other hand, you get to campaign at the top of your lungs for your pro-choice position, even maneuvering every way you can so that the anti-abortion viewpoint does not get a fair public hearing. How is that an even-handed position? How is that a level playing field? Why is it then that you call yourself tolerant while you call me intolerant? Why do you characterize your arguments as objective while you characterize my arguments as subjective, self-indulgent, undisciplined, and so forth? The classic choice for tolerance, in its original sense, is either to tolerate with great distaste what we find genuinely and objectively abhorrent, or the other choice, the easier choice, is to try to impose one's agenda on those who disagree. Now, what choice do you make? And clearly, what a militant secularist like this is doing is choosing the second choice. And then you would say, oh, I see. So you want me to make the hard choice and to tolerate what I find abhorrent while you go on campaigning to discredit Christian arguments against abortion so that they never get a fair public hearing. This is clearly not a fair debate. That is why you are tolerant and I am intolerant. Of course, I'm saying that sarcastically. It's actually quite the opposite. That is why you have the moral high ground, while I am the self-indulgent sectarian concerned only to advance his own viewpoint. Am I missing something here? You can hear the sarcasm in those statements of mine. So let's look at this and then make some final reflections. Dealing with a militant secularist like this And I'm not making up these examples. I have engaged in these sorts of debates many, many times, not only on the issue of abortion, but on many other issues as well. And this is the basic position that one finds in many, many cases. The rules of debate, the rules of discourse, and so on are defined completely to the advantage of the other party, and the attempt is to rule out any Christian arguments from the very beginning. They're simply ruled out as not belonging in polite society, not belonging in educated circles, not belonging in modern culture, in the modern intellectual world, so that you never get a seat at the table, you don't have a voice in public discourse. Let's have some final reflections now. Rodney Stark, the one who has outlined the ideas about monotheism and revealed religion that I've been talking about, he may be technically wrong in his suggestion about the disappearance of the monotheistic worldview in today's cultural elite. That viewpoint has not disappeared. It's just that the term monotheism might not be the right label for it. The militant secularist that I've just sketched is, in fact, a hardcore monotheist in the sense that he is committed to an exclusionary ideology and one that demonizes opponents with all the fury of ex cathedra denunciations of heresy and so forth. It really is, in a sense, his ideology is his revealed religion. And he holds to that with all the sort of exclusive, intolerant bigotry that he condemns in others. The militant secularist is often a monotheist for whom the socio-political state is God, and for whom the political activists that are his colleagues and comrades in arms, they are the elect congregation in his form of religion. Political religion and the empowered monotheism in Occidental society today, predominantly in a predominantly secularist kind of environment as you might have, for example, in present 21st century United States of America. And these sorts of religions enjoy all the advantages of state religions of earlier times, which were precisely the abuses of power that the original formulation of tolerance was meant to address. In other words, in these earlier societies, the power of the state, the power of public disapproval could be marshaled against those minorities who hold unpopular viewpoints, and they could be effectively coerced either into silence or in some cases coerced to viewing themselves in a kind of self-hating way, so that they, in a sense, don't even respect their own viewpoint or their own congregation or their own group with which they identify. That was the kind of abuse of power that was exercised in earlier societies, where you would have a state church and you would have this sort of alliance between religion and the state. What we often have nowadays is an alliance between secularism and the state, so that the powers of the state and the powers of a secularly defined public sphere can be marshaled against the religious believer, so that his arguments never get their day in court, they never get a fair hearing in the marketplace of ideas. The idea of tolerance was to make sure that those sorts of minority viewpoints do get a public hearing, and that independent thinkers get a chance to consider as many viewpoints as possible. So the sort of campaigning that we see to dominate the public sphere and rule out moral or religious arguments in advance is absolutely opposed to the notion of tolerance in its original sense. But the word tolerance or the word intolerance is often used just as a weapon or a tool, as a club, to justify defining the rules of debate in this way, so that viewpoints that one disagrees with are ruled out of bounds from the very beginning by labeling them as intolerance. The use of the word tolerance in that case is anything but tolerant. You are using the word tolerance as a club to beat over the head people with whom you disagree. There's nothing that could be more intolerant. And that's why tolerance is today mostly an incoherent term. It's often used by people that understand very little about the history of the term, and they're often blind to their own intolerance. And they simply use that word as a club against people with whom they disagree. It's almost always used in a negative sense, in the sense, how dare you be so intolerant? And of course, the kinds of arguments that are labeled in are always arguments that are on the sort of blacklist of the ideology of the person who's throwing that term around. So if you look at it in sort of a strategic sense, how is the word used as a weapon? It's clearly used just as a weapon to beat people over the head. It has very little to do with these rather difficult principles of actually practicing tolerance in its original sense. So let's go back. This is my last slide. The incoherent notion of tolerance applied to revealed religion. And there I am, Bruce Boeckel, PhD, and so on and so forth. It's been a pleasure sharing with you, and if you have any questions for discussion, I'd be glad to take those at this time.
Oh, yeah, I think I have a few questions. Well, I do notice that this is something that is obvious if you debate or talk with anybody in the public square about anything religious, whether it be about intelligent design, whether it be about abortion, whether it be about public policy. It is used as a club to shut you up, to intellectually bully you into silence. The concern that I have is at the local church level, the layperson, the people out on the street talking with these individuals, they're the ones that don't know how to refute this in a simple form. You know what I mean? Like a form that's, first of all, they don't even know. I mean, they're just afraid of being called a bigot.
Exactly. And they're bullied into silence.
And so it works. It's very effective. I've sort of used it, reversed it on them in the past, where I have said, well, that was very intolerant of you, isn't it?
I think that's also something else that comes up, is that it's so much easier to just say you're intolerant, but then to try to get into some kind of conversation with them to say, well, no, that's not really what you mean. I mean, it's a nice little bomb that they can drop, a one liner that they can kind of drive by insult, and then they're off.
Right.
And it's really hard to respond to that kind of remark, which definitely falls into the whole political religions part that you brought up, Bruce, which I thought was really interesting. In a secular state where it was, the thought was, or the intent was for it to overcome the oppression that was there, really becomes the oppression itself. And I think that fits with the political world, with sound bites and just everything else that we're encountering.
Used as a club to beat people over the head, the term tolerance or intolerance is used to enforce a kind of oppressive intellectual regime.
Well, and I think that they want to get their, well, of course, they want to get their own way. And this is the only way. They can't get it by the logic or the merit of the argument. So they have to basically start with the ad hominem attacks and so on and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Don's suggestion about intelligent design is a good one. There's a book called Traipsing Through Evolution, which is a report on which intelligent design was being debated, whether it should be included in the curriculum. I think it was in the state of Kansas. And so those who were debating against intelligent design, what was their viewpoint? Was their viewpoint that intelligent design should be included in the curriculum so that students could consider its arguments? No, their viewpoint was that intelligent design should be ruled out and removed from the curriculum so that students don't get to consider it at all. So that Darwinism would be the exclusive viewpoint in high school biology classes in that state. So I think, an easy argument to make, or at least raise this, for awareness when one is involved in a discussion like this is, how is that a tolerant position to be arguing for an exclusively Darwinist teaching of biology? There's another kid on the block that also has arguments that it would like an audience to consider, and yet your position is you don't want the audience to even consider that other argument. You want an exclusionary Darwinist form of biology. How is an exclusionary Darwinist biology a tolerant position?
Well,
that argument is absurd on the face of it.
Well, yeah, too, but it also stifles scientific discovery if you think about it, because a lot of the revolutions in science have come from the minority voice of scientists who say this is the way it works, and then through, the paradigm shifts and all that kind of stuff that
exactly.
Kuhn talks about. But I think it's really interesting that it is, in a sense, the same thing with the intelligent design. Of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I don't want to make it seem like it's really simple, because there's the whole presupposition of naturalism and that. But I think that they still use this very same thing. And when I debate or talk with atheists online, it invariably comes up where intolerance is thrown out there. And sometimes they don't call you intolerant. Sometimes they call you bigot. Sometimes they do it in much more subtle ways, which I think is also difficult for people to see, because if they come at you and they just make a snide comment or something like that, so it doesn't come up right to the surface where they say the word intolerant, but that's exactly what they mean.
Right.
It's the worst type of sophistry you can come up with, because it's really not about influencing people, it's about coercing them. And and that's the problem. I don't know if Rob had anything else to say, because he was giving us a little bit of feedback. But you have anything else, Rob?
No, I just thank you for the Rodney Stark reference. I've heard the name. I haven't read any of his materials before. And then also, thanks for the example of the possible dialogues that you have in the section on tolerance on the street. I definitely appreciate that. So thank you for all the work. And the only other thing I have to say is I have to get into another call. So thanks, guys. God bless you both for the work you're doing, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Rob.
All right. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, so, do you have anything else, Bruce?
Yes. One of the points you were making about when you sort of get into the give and take of debates with people, and they throw out the notion of tolerant, they accuse you of being intolerant and so forth, sometimes in subtle ways. I think one of the reasons for this, and this I think would be a topic for another presentation, is the whole notion of developmental psychology that's pretty predominant in the field of psychology, and there's a sort of a street version of this. The street version of this is that the immature person is the person who believes everything that they have been taught as a child, and the classic form of the argument is that that's the religious teaching that you received as a child. And then when you become a full, enlightened, independent, autonomous adult, you throw overboard all of those beliefs. You become the modern enlightened secularist. And that is made not merely as an ideological argument, but as a developmental psychological argument. People that really do argue that sort of the secularist viewpoint is the defining feature of the modern mind. And religious belief is the defining feature of the medieval mind, which is not fully autonomous, not fully mature, not fully adult. In other words, they think of you as sort of a child. If you're a believer, you exercise childlike black and white thinking, right? That sort of black and white thinking, right and wrong, good and evil, that's all childish. And it's amazing to me the degree to which even in Christian circles people have sort of imbibed this view. It's a view both of the development of the human person and it's a view of Western society. That's why we think of the medieval ages, the Dark Ages, because that was Western society before it grew up, right? So that's, in a sort of street version, that's what people have in their mind. And often Christians themselves have internalized these arguments to such an extent that they're sort of under the shadow of them. And that's why it's so easy for them to be bullied, because they're called intolerant, and what immediately rushes to their mind is this, this version of the infantile thinker who's still living in the dark ages and so on and so forth, and they immediately shut up. They have internalized this bullying to such an extent that all it takes is a word or two spoken, to them with someone else watching, in a crowd or whatever, and they immediately shut up. They have sort of internalized their own ideological suppression.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I internalize their ideology. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. This has been a very great conversation, I think, and this is something that I think that more and more of us need to work on and have good answers to, and good ways of enlightening the enlightened, so to speak. Maybe. All
right, thanks a lot, John.
All right, thanks. And for everybody else that's listening, we have next month coming up strategies for integrating apologetics into your local church with our guest, Carrie Waldy. And we'll see you next time.